on the side of the playing and learning tunes and such. Um, any strategies that you do when it comes to learning complex chord changes beyond learning the scales? Is there anything as far as the creative approach? And I guess that could be applied to any kind of improvisational element. Anything that you do that you find really kind of helps break you out of that cycle of just playing the scales and arpeggios?
No, I mean, that's where we start. You
Right.
know, you start with the building blocks of a chord. And um, so, so often knowing the components of a chord gets you part of the way. But what is it that takes you further? You know, because just like when you're playing a non-complex chord, it's a dominant chord, or just an altered dominant chord. Um, you can play different notes that aren't in the actual chord. Of course, you can play flat nines, sharp 11s, and flat 13s and things, and different. You can play melodic minor scale a half step above the root of the chord, and think in those terms. Um, but then it's such an interesting question, because then it becomes like, well, what sounds good to you? A very non-technical way of thinking about it is, well, if you play strongly, if you play something definitely, it 9 times out of 10, why is it that when you play in a particular key that if you play notes that are just completely wrong, why do they sound? Sometimes they sound right. If you play a half step above the root of the chord, or a whole step above the root of the chord, or a whole step below the root of the chord, and some like, you know, why is it that? Well, that sounded really cool. If you play it weakly, oh, he's made a mistake. That's got to be wrong. So being definite with what you put across makes a big difference, and um, and then there's also the issue of tension and release, where how people say, how do you consider playing out? One thing is to simply exploit the tensions of a chord. Play, getting into you know um, over a dominant chord, play uh, explore the notes of a diminished scale, which incorporate uh, all the um, all the altered notes, but not except for the flat 13. A melodic minor scale over for instance, a melodic minor scale a half step above the root of the chord. If you play a C dominant chord and you play a C sharp melodic minor, that's going to incorporate, starting on C, it's going to incorporate all the notes that are altered, including the flat 13. So you can practice those kinds of things too. But what's funny is that I would ask Chick questions like that all the time. There were the first record we did with Light that I'm on was Light Years, the band's second record, and that was like a studio produced record, and that was the only one of those that we ever did that way. Every other record subsequently was all recorded live in the studio. In fact, we recorded a lot of times. We were seeing the music for the first time in the studio. We'd run it once or twice and then record, and so not a lot of time to get into the blowing things, right? And I go up to Chick and I say, "Hey, Chick, this one solo is pretty tricky. What would you suggest over this one part?" And he'd say, "Okay, just you can try this or try that," and he'd play different things, or you can try to leave space, And my joking answer would be like, "Well, great, man, but what do I do between the spaces? What do I do when I'm actually playing?" And um, and so very quickly I realized that Chick had unbelievable knowledge, but he didn't really think of it that way. Yeah, he knew that the sharp nine of a C dominant chord was an E flat, but um, he would really just sort of hear it, and he had it in his head, and he just tried it so many times, and he had this amazing talent, needless to say, but he also just would hear what a melody should be. And so again, we want to start with the theory side, but we also want to do, that's another reason that why practicing is so important. Practicing just means playing. Brian Scanlon, the great jazz tenor player in the Fat Band, a lot of times he'll tell students, just play, whatever, just put the thing in your mouth and blow. Just go. And if you're stuck, if you're stuck with a song, if you're stuck with just playing, and just by getting the sound in your head, you get, it doesn't develop perfect pitch necessarily, but you do get, you and I have both played B so many gazillions of times in our lives that we kind of have a pretty good relative pitch, unless you have perfect pitch, I don't know. But, of what that note what that note sounds like, you can pretty much pick it out. And so by playing a lot, you develop unless, again, you have perfect pitch, you develop your relative pitch to the point where it's almost as good as as somebody with perfect pitch, But just being confident, and that's another thing too, when you play, just, just thinking about what you're about to play before you do it. Just if your concentration is a little bit ahead of what you're doing, we talked about that in terms of just playing in general, but it has a lot to do with how you're going to weave through a chord. And now you're not just thinking about what you sound like, but how are you sounding relative to, along with what you're playing with, the song that you're playing, the set of chords that you're playing over. And that, that also takes you a long way. I have so many friends who don't know the first thing about, what do you call this chord with that chord. They just do it, you just play. And, so a lot of that has to do with developing your ear.
Yeah, so true. And I think isolating a sound, like you're saying, you find a sound that maybe you're not less comfortable with at first. Yeah. And isolate it. I like to put a play along on for an hour on one chord. And I've played everything I know in 10 seconds. And then it's like, okay, now I got to figure out what can I create out of this thing, and really get inside it and approach that unfamiliar sound in the same way I would a familiar sound in terms of how I would practice scale patterns and things like that, just to get more familiar with it.
Yeah. And you're talking, you mentioned the word sound so often. Our sound carries us so far. There's nothing more important in our playing than our sound. There are a lot of great players out there whose playing I appreciate, but I have a hard time listening to the record more than once because the sound isn't as good. Conversely, Dexter Gordon's sound, Stan Getz's sound, you name it. There's so many great players whose sounds were just so just captivating, And so for all of us, as long as we're interestingly, we all start with a great sound. We have to make sure that we don't do things to mess it up, to mask it, with it, making sure that our embouchure is not screwing us up, or our throat, or our diaphragm. With the embouchure, making sure that we're not biting too hard. If you're biting too hard, the vibration of the reed is where the sound comes from, right? So the more we have to use some embouchure to set the reed up, but the more we press with either a teeth up top or our embouchure down below, we're limiting the vibration with the more pressure. So the less vibration, the more pinched the sound actually is. So you have to determine what the correct amount of pressure is. And that, you determine that by using your ear. Listen to how, if you're hearing the overtones. And then you make up, we've talked about the embouchure being the bad guy and the air diaphragm being the good guy. The air is what's creating the sound from the air standpoint. That's what's getting the reed to vibrate. But it's air. There's nothing tangible that is limiting. It's the opposite. It's getting the reed to vibrate in the first place. It's not limiting the vibration. So thinking about the sound the way we generate it, as far as the air, moving the air forward. So making sure that you're projecting through the horn. But, we always talk about projecting through the horn, but you do want to visualize, how the air is hitting the reed. And that, so to a point, we really kind of think about just to hear, and then another thought, pushes it forward. So making sure that the air is moving forward, and then at the same time making sure that we're proactive with our sound and our playing, rather than being reactive. Being reactive means you start like this. Right. So I reacted to the fact that I sounded like crap at the beginning. And so, what was I doing? I was using too much pressure here. My tongue wasn't set up correctly. My ear wasn't set up correctly. My throat wasn't set up correctly. So be proactive with all that preparation. And okay, so the tongue is your brake pedal, the air is your gas pedal, and you're on your dragster at the starting gate, and the tree is going down. You hit the green light. Before it hits green, you're revving up your engine, which is the air, and you've got the tongue on the reed, which is hitting the brake. And then as soon as you release the reed with the tongue, the sound comes out immediately. So that's a very, very good thing to practice, making sure that you've got all that prepared so that the sound is 100% there quickly. And then lastly, the throat, making sure your throat is open, which is to say that you're like, when you yawn, when you're warming up your hands, when you speak in a low voice, that opens it up. People talk about playing high notes all the time. How do you get high notes? In my opinion, it's all right here. If your throat isn't open and you go for a G, it doesn't come out. But if you open your throat, right? So I can go back and forth, just closed, open, and this happens. Just saying e ah, having that happen. So when you open it up, suddenly now your air is your air flow is way more, conducive to allowing that, you've got a bigger flow of air, and not only are you able to hit those notes, but they're coming out much more solid, much more full. Same thing down low notes too. If your throat isn't set up, isn't open, then those low notes are going to sound blatty and oftentimes inconsistent as far as they're coming out the way you want them to.
I love that. And that was one thing that I was going to ask about is if you use like a vocable syllable, when you're playing, or if it's something that you're not necessarily aware of. But it sounds like, especially in the extremes of the register, that plays a role, in at least in some form when you're playing.
Yeah, the position of your throat plays a role. In my opinion, rather in my case, I don't actually utter a sound. Some people are singing something, and it creates a very, very cool. I just can't do it. A cool like growl up top, or a different kind of a sound. When you're like, if you try to do the split. That's just a matter of putting a little bit more pressure on the heart of the reed, blowing a little extra hard, and putting a bit more pressure. It sets up the reed so that the tip is coming up a little bit, but the center of the reed is coming up a little bit more, and it allows for that split tone. And then I think when you're playing aggressively, you get more of an aggressive tone naturally. You get that sort of growl. You can literally let some air escape out of the side of your mouth, So you don't hear it in the heat of battle when you're playing in a band. You don't hear, you can hear if you're sitting right here, but you don't. All you hear is the cool growling effect. that kind of thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, that reminded me. I got the tips and tricks video and
Yeah.
booklet, and I remember you talking about the letting the air out of the side of the mouth, and I spent weeks and weeks working on that.
Well,
Um,
sorry.
no, I mean, I loved, and it was the fact that there was somebody of your caliber, a contemporary musician with all of these, different tools at your disposal that had an educational material out, and I just ate that up. I got, I think you had the 2 videos at the time, and the book, and I've got the book and the exercises book. And yeah, it's definitely been a huge influence, and I know that a lot of people have really enjoyed that. Let's maybe I know you've got a track pulled up there. Maybe we can hear it all kind of put together.
Oh, um, sure. Let me see. I kind of had something where I don't know. What do you want to hear?
Well, anything that you feel like playing, we would love to
Uh,
hear it.
Thank you. Let's see. I have this little sunny track from my school here. I don't know if you can hear this or not. Can you hear that? Okay.
Yep. Amazing. Okay, I think we've got just a couple more minutes. I am going to let's do like a little lightning round here. These could be, 1-word answers, and let's see. We're gonna do a couple that are saxophone music related, and maybe a couple that aren't. Okay, here we go. What's the weirdest place you've ever practiced?
In the stairwell in the Disneyland band room.
Okay. Uh, Saxophone superpower you wish you had.
That I could play like Michael Brecker.
Okay. Yeah, me too. Um, if you weren't a saxophonist, what would you do?
I'd be a professional grandfather because I'm a grandpa, and that's my yeah, that's what I do when I'm not playing.
Strangest fan encounter.
um, uh, I've had some interesting ones in autograph lines where people wanted me to sign particular interesting parts of body parts that I would probably want to keep my wife from finding out about.
Okay. One piece of gear you secretly hoard.
Uh, well, reeds and ligatures. I've got a whole bunch of ligatures. I got about 100 ligatures, and I have enough reeds to start a major wildfire. Yeah.
Okay, and then this could be maybe the same answer. What's always in your sax besides your horn?
It's
Like
always
your
on
sax
my set.
case.
Oh, well, my uh, AirPod. I mean, the little tracker, and yeah, reeds for sure.
Okay. Your guilty pleasure music that's not jazz.
Opera.
Ah, I've been trying to get more into the opera stuff and go into LA Opera. I went to several shows last
Oh,
year.
cool.
Yeah. One food that you must have after the gig.
Pizza.
Ah, excellent.
After the gig, well, I'm trying to cut down the pizza because for obvious reasons. But ask anybody in that I travel with that you know back in the old days it was patty melts, but that ended quickly. But pizza was a biggie.
Yeah, I'm a pizza fiend as well. If you could have dinner with any musician, living or dead, who would it be?
Miles.
Okay. Go to karaoke song.
Zero, because I can't sing worth a you know what.
Same here. Dog or cat person?
Cat.
Favorite city you ever traveled to?
Rome.
All right. One hobby you have that fans might not know about.
Uh, um, Hobby. I'm not much of a hobbyist. I cook. I'm a cooker.
Okay.
I'm a cooker.
Well, that's makes one of us.
I'm a cooker.
Um, uh,
I go in the kitchen and I go cooker. Yes.
last one here. One app you can't live without.
My metronome, man. My metronome. Any saxophone player who doesn't say that, man, you are, come on. Right there.
Excellent.